Well, good afternoon, everyone, or evening, or I don't know, maybe even morning, depending on where you are. This is Breakthrough News. You are watching the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here alongside my intrepid co host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back alongside you.
It's great to be back alongside you, Eugene. You're coming to us remotely, not in the studio, which is why there's a bit of a different look
Yes.
today. Yeah,
Yes, I was
but
just
still
about to say
looking
that.
great.
Thank you for letting people know. Thank you. I appreciate
You're
that.
welcome.
I try to all the time look great. You've got a lot to keep up with here on this show. But nonetheless, very happy to be here. Very happy to be back with all of you out there in viewer land or listening if you don't have to be watching or happening to be watching right now. A lot of things I could say. If you happen to be watching on YouTube, one of the things I will say is make sure you go ahead and hit the subscribe button, then go ahead and hit the bell so that you get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to. And if you happen to be watching us here on Free Speech TV, you don't need to do anything. Just keep watching, keep supporting Free Speech TV, and shout out to the whole FSTV team for making it possible for us to be here with you. And Ron, are there other aspects you would like our viewers to know about before we start the show or as we start the show?
Yes, I want to remind people to make sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Ooh, beautiful noise. On top of that, make sure you are subscribed. Make sure you share wherever you can. And most importantly, make sure if you are able to, you are doing everything in your power to help support Breakthrough News. You can do that by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a member for as little as $5 a month, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, such as this beautiful Breakthrough News mug that I'm very carefully turning around so I don't drop all over my keyboard. Success. But on top of that, I mean, it's super, super important if you are able to open that pocket up, you guys, and help support our programming here at Breakthrough News. Independent media is more important than ever. We're coming after over a year of genocide in Gaza. We just reached the end of an incredibly destructive war on Lebanon that could reopen at any time. I'm coming to you from Lebanon right now, where I'm often hearing Israeli drones and jet planes buzzing ahead. Oftentimes, those jets are in the sky to bomb Syria. Israel is now bombing Syria, seizing more land, pushing forward with that Greater Israel project. And we want to keep covering the massive seismic shifts across this region and across the world, as empire becomes more depraved on its nosedive down. So if you can, it's all on you guys to help keep supporting the show. So patreon.com/breakthrough news.
It really is all on you. And, shout out to everyone who has become a patron so far, made a one time donation. Really been fantastic, everything you've been able to do. Listen, you think it's a small amount of money, $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever it may be. But when a lot of us do it all together, it's actually a large sum of money. So, here we are, end of the year. Take stock of your expenses. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and give us a monthly donation. Well, Rania, as you already sort of alluded to here, there's quite a bit going on pretty much in every corner of the globe. So we want to jump right into it. And we want to start today in West Africa, where there's quite a bit going on, from Chad and Senegal kicking out French troops, the elections in Ghana, a lot to be had there. So we are very happy to have with us to discuss all of this and more Chiwechi Opoku, who is the convener of the Socialist Movement of Ghana. Chiwechi, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. We are great fans of your work, great beneficiaries of what Breakthrough does in West Africa. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Well, the pleasure is all ours, and we are big fans of the SMG. So great to have you here to break some of this down. Maybe let's work from east to west, as it were, and start with some of what we've been seeing in the Sahel and Senegal and the ongoing issues in Francophone Africa. I wonder what significance you give to what we've seen, especially vis-a-vis Chad kicking out French troops. A country that has been known as a very close ally of France. And so on and so forth, what it says about the state of the struggle against neocolonialism in West Africa.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think what it says and what all of us here are increasingly recognizing is that the masses are in revolt. There's a ferment in which the ordinary people of all the francophone countries, as we call them, are rejecting both the conditions of oppression, of exploitation, but also increasingly are increasingly conscious that that relates to their historical relationship with France. Okay, it expresses itself in many different ways. It sometimes expresses as an anti-white thing. It expresses as an anti-French thing, but it's basically a rejection of colonial relations. It's a rejection of hundreds of years of exploitation and of direct oppression by France. And I think that consciousness is growing very, very rapidly. And it's not only in the francophone countries. It's not only This is not only happening in the Sahel. It's happening along the littoral, and the whole of certainly the whole of West Africa is on fire. It just takes different forms and has not peaked in the way that it's peaking in the Sahel. So Sahel is the front line, but it reflects a trend that is taking place throughout the region.
And when we talk about France's military presence across the Sahel, can you just give a brief overview of what that military presence was for? I mean, I know France has an economically exploitative relationship in the Sahel as well, but it's also, there's also resource extraction taking place. So when we talk about the French being kicked out, what does that mean in terms of military, in terms of economic relationship?
Okay. So these are countries that were formerly French colonies. They were areas of exclusive French exploitation for hundreds of years. This is not a new phenomenon. France has been in control of those territories for centuries. And as different resources are discovered, France has tended to monopolize them and monopolize them to the detriment of the indigenous people whose these resources belong to. In the 60s, following World War II and following the spread of American influence and so on, France was compelled, like all of its European colleagues, to relinquish direct colonial control over its territories. What it did, however, and there are many fantastic stories about just the level of conspiratorial, dealings around this. But essentially, France has retained control over the currencies of these countries. The the central banking has essentially been done from France, which controls their possibilities for development and for making decisions about the direction of even of domestic investments. France has also ensured that its capitalist class has a right of first refusal on the development of any resources discovered, but also on any sort of commercial transaction. You find that throughout these countries, it is French companies that control almost anything of value and which set the terms on which their own um, exploitation is run. But all of this is only possible if you do two other things. One, you control the national politics. You control it in the sense of asserting a right to veto who becomes head of state, who forms a government in any of these countries. So you can have the almost charade of democratic processes, but if you end up with a result that France doesn't like, you're not going to last more than 2 years. And chaos will be engineered to the point where France is able to install a puppet that suits its agenda. And then the fourth point, of course, is that that kind of direct political subordination is only possible if you have troops on the ground. So throughout the independent history of these countries, France has maintained military forces in each of them. And those military forces have been used to impose French will on the societies. It's not as simple as having 1,000 troops, but those 1,000 troops then have networks within the national militaries and operate in ways that even your own national army becomes a tool against you. And what we're seeing over the last 2 years is that those armies have also joined the rebellion against French control of their lives. Okay, does that give a picture?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it does. Wow.
It does. It does. Very, very important picture and a good one. And I think it's brings me to the next topic I want to raise. Ghana, where you're based, recently just had presidential elections. Mr. Mahama, former president, came back as the new president, making a number of promises about improving people's lives and the like. And interestingly enough, the U.S. prior to the election sort of trying to put their thumb on the scale one way or the other, it seemed, by announcing the possibility of sanctions if you were deemed to be disrupting the electoral process. So I guess my question is sort of two-part here. First is maybe what we should be expecting from the new administration in Ghana, if it is a big shift for the working classes, the popular classes there or not. And I'm also curious your thoughts about why the U.S. would have made such a big statement from Anthony Blinken in the lead up to the election, what the stakes are for countries in the West, imperialist countries, in the outcome of the elections in Ghana.
Well, I think it is fair to say that this election outcome does reflect the short-term will of the people. There's no question about it that John Mahama was a more popular candidate, that his party is much more acceptable to the working people of Ghana. Okay. But at a more fundamental level, it's again the same process. It is the people of the country rejecting neocolonialism. It is rejecting the extreme and grotesque forms in which neocolonialism expressed itself in Ghana over the last 8 years. Because we've had in power the political party that was traditionally the far right. There's a political party whose leadership are largely descendants of the old pre-colonial aristocracies and so on. They are the people whose, because of that social positioning, accessed things like education, things like commercial opportunities earliest. So they have always been a social elite, but they're a social elite that was radically displaced in the 40s and 50s when Nkrumah entered the liberation struggle and formed a party which displaced the elite program of taking over colonial positions and continuing to run colonial relations, but with themselves rather than the British on top. So Nkrumah destroyed that, and in the process, disorganized their grip on power for generations. And it was in order to get back into power that they literally introduced the staging of coup d'etats into Ghana's politics. Okay. Due to mistakes that the Social Democrats and the left made in the 80s, it was possible for the incumbent regime to begin to reinvent itself, reposition itself as a more centrist organization, okay, which allowed them then to begin to attract a genuine vote, making them truly, a democratic rival to the NDC, which is the latest expression of, disorganized but definitely popular will. And what we've seen now is 8 years in which the public is very clear what they represent. Because while over the last 2 decades, perhaps, they began to represent themselves as centrists, as being interested in social reform, social programs. When they got hold of power in the way they have for the last 8 years, they showed their true colors. The level of just sheer exploitation of the masses increased. The level of sheer corruption by public officials, the level of just arrogance on the part of the ruling elite skyrocketed. So, literally, all the credible polls over the last year have predicted that they would not likely to get more than 40% of the vote. So, you're seeing reflected in a slightly more liberal democratic environment the same processes that you're seeing in the Sahel. But because we don't have the same sort of pressure cooker situation, it's taking the form of electoral battles and so on. Where does that leave us? President Mahama is inheriting a huge mess. Ghana is indebted to the hilt. Ghana's institutions are corrupted, utterly corrupted, not just in terms of people taking bribes and so on, but just in terms of their inability to operate and deliver the services for which they were created. Our institutions have all collapsed. So he's going to have the task, or we are all going to have the task of trying to rebuild our institutions, revive an economy, begin to deliver greater social justice. Because if you can't do that, it's all going to collapse very, very quickly. He's going to have the task of doing that. And it's not going to be an easy task. The indications are that there will be no honeymoon. People have expectations. It's in the nature of bourgeois electoral campaigns, at least in this part of the world, that all sorts of promises have been made. Many of those promises cannot be kept. Whether the masses will tolerate, I think people do understand that some of these promises can be kept and that it will be a process. Just how much space he'll be given to maneuver is difficult to say. So we have a difficult period ahead, but it's also a period of progressive political opportunity because the only real solution to Ghana's problems is going to be a mobilization of our people, of our resources, of the spirit of self-reliance. And necessarily, in doing that, the ideological work that gives that shape will come to the fore again. It will be a struggle, no question about that. Don't want to create the illusion that Ghana or West Africa is in a revolutionary mode. That's not where we are. But the struggle is certainly heating up. As to what the US agenda is, my personal speculation is that in the context of the turmoil in the Sahel in particular, but as I've said, more largely through West Africa, it's important to stabilize Ghana. The US has a status of forces agreement with Ghana, and it does operate from here. The US has some operations in the Sahel that are run from Ghana. They control entirely one terminal of our airport and so on. So I think ensuring that there was a smooth transition became important for their own short and medium term goals. Historically, they have preferred the right wing party, the MPP that just lost so badly, because it's easier to get things through them. The Social Democratic NDC is a lot more unpredictable. But they could read the tea leaves as well as anybody else, and it was clear that MPP could not deliver a democratic majority. And if they tried to steal or to repress the election, Ghana would have been destabilized. And with that, the the Western ambitions for West Africa would also have been destabilized. So I think this was an entirely defensive, global, strategic, self-interest move. It's not about building democracy in Ghana or any of that stuff. Okay. And in fact, we know that the US is pressing Ghana, La Cote d'Ivoire, and Benin about the possibility of moving at least drone forces, bases to the northern parts of our country, which would be focused on the developments in the Sahel. So I think they just wanted to ensure that there's a smooth succession and that they continue to have access to policymakers.
Well, Opoku, as always, it's fantastic to be able to hear your analysis and that of the SMG, and we really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Take care.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, it's always good to see colonizers being kicked out and, shifts taking place that seem to be going in positive directions. Better news than the other parts of the world. So, sorry, I'm
Yes,
this is
that is
Rania in
true.
pessimistic mode. So yeah, that's all.
Yeah.
Our next story is next story is a pessimistic one too.
That's true. Well, unless you're, a far right person, then it's a great one. We want to turn to Argentina. We're about a year into the presidency of Javier Milei, BFF of Donald Trump. A lot to talk about in Argentina, and I think the broader trends that are flowing out of Argentina, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective. But regardless of your perspective, if you want to be informed about what's happening, you got to read People's Dispatch. And we are honored to be joined here once again by the editor of People's Dispatch, Zoe Alexandra, to discuss this. Zoe, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thanks so much for having me. And I'll say, I feel like I have a challenge now to make Rania laugh. So I have some good stuff up my sleeve.
Yes.
Okay, well, maybe
I like this
I hope
challenge.
you're gonna,
I need this.
bring out some
laughs.
props or something like that.
I don't know. We'll see.
We're about to find out. Well, Zoe, we're about a
guys.
year into Mr. Milei's presidency. Now, of course, the big thing he campaigned on is that he was going to turn around Argentina's economy. All the problems were going to end. Everything was going to be great. Looking in, doesn't really seem like he's met his promise. But what do we know about with the state of the economy and whether he's been able to revive anything at all over this first year of his term?
Well, it has definitely been an interesting year of Javier Milei. I just want to remind people who this president is before I get into some of these economic policies. This is someone who talks to his dead dog through a medium, who cloned his dead dog, who is currently his main advisor in the presidency is his sister. He's alienated a lot of his earlier close advisors. This is not a person who is well or sane in any way. And as you said, his main promise, he came in and he said, similar to a Donald Trump kind of phrase, like, I'm going to drain the swamp. But he said, I'm going to attack the political caste. I'm going to take away all their privileges. All these Peronists, all these left-wing terrorists have just destroyed our country, and I'm going to save it. And consistently, this slogan of I'm going to attack the political caste, I'm going to take away their privileges, has been met by a counter slogan by, mass movements, social movements in the country by saying, when he was talking about the caste, he was talking about us. He was talking about poor people. He was talking about working class movements. And he's talking about, the 50% of people in Argentina who are currently poor. And so essentially with all of his policies over the last year, which involves firing tens of thousands of state workers, which involves not increasing the amount that pensioners were given to make sure that it was in line with inflation. Argentina is a country that has levels of inflation that are difficult to comprehend. If you're sitting in the United States, it's difficult to understand that one day you go to the grocery store, imagine buying something with $1, the next day it might cost $10. That's the level of inflation that exists in Argentina. I mean, from I think it was 2022 to 2023, it was way over 100%. The last year, again, it was over 100%. He has gotten some economic indicators down. And it's important to point out, and a lot of people are saying, all these leftists are criticizing Javier Milei, but, look what he's been able to do with the budget. Look at how he's been able to, in some respects, control inflation. And something happened over the past year when he essentially attacked the public budget, when he cut all these social programs, when he fired all these state workers, when he reduced the number of ministries in the country in half. We saw that famous video of him taking down science ministry, education ministry. We're cutting all of these. What's happened is that the purchasing power of Argentine people has essentially gone completely down. So people are unable to buy goods. They're unable to, essentially survive. And so that has caused a lot of prices to now go down as a kind of secondary effect of the immense poverty that people are facing. So one of the major conflicts over the last year, this might even be a video of it right now, was of the education sector, where we saw students, professors, and support staff. Yeah, we see the University of the Workers. There's been a mass movement in defense of public education because, again, with the impact of inflation, the current budgets that existed do not account for, the current costs that every single sector would have. And so when you don't increase the budget to make it sure that it fits with the inflation rate, it's actually a decrease in the budget. And that's what happened with the education sector. People were demanding an increase in the budget. Legislators actually did pass this increase, and Milei vetoed it. And so we have university professors who are seeing a massive decline in their salary and their ability to actually buy goods and survive. So, in summary, there's been a lot that's been happened in terms of his cuts, his undermining of different sectors, of different policies. But today we might be able to see a few positive economic indicators, but we have to know that they're literally at the cost of impoverishing larger sectors of the population. More people are now under the poverty line and are essentially unable to buy enough goods to survive.
Wow, that sounds absolutely horrific. But Zoe, in moments of horrific right-wing takeovers, it does offer, an opportunity for left-wing opposition to regroup, recalibrate, perhaps push back. So I'm curious if in this year of Javier Milei, what has the opposition been up to? Is there a formidable opposition to Javier Milei?
Yeah, there's been a number of massive strikes. I know we've talked about them on Breakthrough over the past year. As I mentioned, the education sector has been one of the most impacted because, of course, Argentina is one of actually the only countries in Latin America that still has a very, very open and vibrant, free education in the country. People from all over the continent actually go to Argentina because of the public education that exists there. Of course, it's not only about students, it's about the professors, it's about the workers at the universities. This has been one of the strongest areas of struggle. Also, the pensioners, as I mentioned, because of the impact of inflation and because Milei refused to increase the amount that pensioners were receiving. People who had been working their entire lives expecting to be able to retire and receive a dignified and just pension, found themselves, again, unable to survive. I mean, there are videos of people who are just completely heartbreaking. They're like 70, 80 years old and going to protest and then getting tear gas, getting beat up by the police just because they're demanding what little they need to live in dignity. So pensioners, students, they've been out on the streets, and the major trade union confederations have also been calling national strikes. Recently, there was kind kind of a public dispute in one of the major trade union confederations, actually someone who was in the leadership of CGT, which is one of the largest trade union confederations, left the trade union because he accused them of having too much of a conciliatory attitude with Milei. We know that there's kind of a mix right now of people trying to negotiate and being able to get some benefits for their own union. But what we're seeing really across the board is that people are not going to be able to survive under these policies. They're not surviving already. And this is expressed in kind of mass public outrage to these policies. December 10th marked 1 year of his mandate, but December 19th and 20th will mark over 20 years since the massive social uprising in the early 2000s. We're another situation where Argentina had been completely destroyed by IMF policies, where, again, inflation was at such a level that there was currency that people had to make, different forms of currency, artisanal currency that people had to make to be able to actually buy goods, because the money essentially meant nothing. There were, the piqueteros. This is the famous piqueteros movement, where all of these organizations, the soup kitchens, the cartoneros who recycle cardboard, and that's how they make a living. This is, over 20 years of this movement. So we know there are going to be huge mobilizations on the anniversary of the Red December. So I think we're going to see a lot of tension, and next year is definitely going to continue with the opposition and with the resistance to his policies.
Well, Zoe, as I mentioned at the outset, Milei is very good friends with Trump. He was there in Mar-a-Lago not that long ago. I mean, I wonder if you're expecting, or what you're expecting really from that. I mean, of course, Trump was the president, or when there's another right-wing president in Argentina, Mauricio Macri, and he just ran up a bunch of debts. It's not like Trump bailed him out. But I think some people are perhaps anticipating Trump coming into power could bolster Milei. What are you expecting on that front?
Yeah, he's definitely has a very close friendship with Donald Trump. He was the first foreign leader to visit Trump after his victory. He participated in the CPAC investors meeting and in the America First policy think tank gala. He spoke there. They have a close friendship, but and Milei, he has this outsized view of Argentina. He said that Argentina was once a great world power. I mean, Argentines themselves, even though they have a tendency to really love Argentina and think it's an amazing place, they know Argentina's never been like the leading world power. Milei has this concept that, and this idea that, Argentina should be leading the world in terms of all these other things. Anyway, so he has also a slogan, "Make Argentina Great Again." He's right up there with the MAGA, with Trump. But I mean, the main issue for Argentina right now is the IMF debt. Alberto Fernandez was refused, which was the demand of a lot of the left-wing and progressive movements, which was to cancel the debt, to not pay the debt. He attempted to negotiate. Milei has, continued. There's not going to be debt cancellation, and as long as Argentina has to pay its IMF debt, which it will, Milei has said that he will pay this IMF debt. They're going to have this difficulty, this deficit in their national budget. I don't see Trump making any moves to sacrifice the United States and somehow bail out Argentina, which, in the grand scheme of things, is not a great economic friend or partner for the United States. Argentina's kind of biggest trading partner is China. A lot of their soy gets exported to China. There are, of course, some trade relationships with the United States, but I don't see it being a priority for Donald Trump. There's a lot of ideological unity, but I think if Milei has any sort of illusion that he's going to get some special treatment just because they're the same kind of right-wing crazy, I think he is going to have a shock when he realizes that when Donald Trump says America first, he does not include Argentina in that conception. I mean, we saw Giorgia Meloni also visited Javier Milei. They had a nice little press conference after the G20. He's part of this constellation of right-wing figures, but again, he has this sort of outsized view of the importance of Argentina, and I don't think he's going to be given any favors by the global North with regards to the Argentine economy.
more of a mascot than a player, if you will. But
Yeah,
nonetheless,
precisely.
going to be very interesting to watch, and we shall see how it all goes. And we'll be undoubtedly calling on you many more times here to help us sort through it all. But of course, People's Dispatch, which you can always read every day, is keeping us up to date on Argentina and basically every single country on earth. I don't know how you do it, but you do it. Zoe Alexandra, editor of People's Dispatch, as always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me. And I will say that I think I'm enough, so mission accomplished.
You made me smile several times, Zoe. Mission accomplished. Well, Eugene.
It's a good mission control, Houston.
Yeah, I like transforming the Freedom Side into let's make Rania smile when she's down. Oh, wow. There's a dog.
Can you hear that dog in the background? Is that what you said? Oh, wow.
I can hear the howling dog.
This is an animal-friendly show right here, dog. This is how we.
Yeah, of course.
We're pro-dog. We're very pro-dog. Good dog. Great dog.
That was true.
Nonetheless,
not a fan of.
Let's.
Never mind.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say I'm more of a dog than a cat person, but then I just feel like I alienated a whole bunch of people who are now just gonna cancel their subscriptions to Breakthrough News. So I take it back. Love all animals equally. Please give us
whatever your favorite
support.
animal is. My favorite animal.
It's mine too.
So moving forward here to another story, one that I actually really wish was getting more coverage than it is outside of the state of Virginia, and that is the recently reported attempted self-immolation by a number of prisoners at Red Onion State Prison, the Supermax prison there in the state of Virginia, Rania and I's home state. And we are very honored to be joined here once again on the show to discuss this and more by two Black. So poet, organizer, host of the Black Miss podcast, and author of the book, relatively new book, Laundering Black Rage, The Washing of Black Death, People, Property, and Profits. As always, two Black, great to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm not much of a dog or cat person, so I don't know if I fit in here or not, but got happy to be back.
We appreciate the honesty. We're honest on this show.
Pro animal though, just not in my home, but pro animal. Yeah.
Respect.
Yeah.
This story that has been floating around for several weeks now, I believe it was political prisoner Kevin Rashid Johnson who broke the story. I know the Virginia Defender out of Richmond has done some more reporting here, but there's been some dispute. I know the state is saying that the story is either only partially true or not true. So if you could just tell us what we know about these at least attempted self-immolations there in Red Onion.
Yeah, there's different reports, but from what I've been able to read, 6 people self-immolated, as in caught themselves on fire as a means of protest, not just as a means of self-harm, as the state's trying to depict it. And this has been over a series of months. This hasn't all just happened, I believe, if I'm correct, like just in one day, but over a series of time. 6 people within the prison have attempted to do that. And one of them was saying because there's they don't have a center for these things inside the prison, so they know when they get burned, they have to be sent to another prison. And they're doing this in protest to get out of the prison because the conditions are so horrible. And this is not uncommon. Here in Indiana, my co-director of the Pendleton 2 film that we put on this station, King Trill, aka Jock, he once went on a hunger strike purposely to get transferred. Like that was the goal, to get transferred out, because some of these prisons are just so unbearable. You're trying to get to the prison that is, I guess, semi-inhabitable. None of them are great, but some of them are safer and some of them have more funding and resources. So you're just trying to get to that, similar to someone trying to get to a better plantation.
So, what's interesting about this prison in particular is back in my early days of journalism, I actually focused quite a bit on criminal justice issues, or should I say criminal injustice system issues. And I actually wrote a piece in 2012 I like pulled it up because
Truth
I was
out.
like, I know Red Onion. Yes. I was like, I know
Yep.
Red
Yeah, I
Onion
remember.
State Prison
Yeah.
because,
Yeah.
okay, so there was a hunger strike back then.
Mhm.
And I remember looking into this prison and just being completely horrified. I mean, a lot of prisons across the country that are super max or like maximum security have a lot of really horrific conditions, but this one in particular, I mean, they were like breaking fingers and like just blatantly torturing people. So I guess, I mean, that was 2012. There was a hunger strike. That's why I was writing about that. I was covering a hunger strike at Red Onion State Prison over those conditions. Now we're talking about over a decade later. Can you tell us a bit about the conditions in this prison? It must be pretty bad for people to light themselves on fire. That is a desperate plea for help.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was this was in the People's Dispatch. There was a report by Amnesty International about this prison and Human Rights Watch, primarily about the supermax. And a lot of people may not know about supermaxes, but people are spending in supermax. You're spending 23 hours on lockdown, solitary. You're in segregation. That means you don't get out of your cell. Many times these cells are windowless. You don't have much human contact. When you walk out of your cell, you have to lock up, and then they escort you on a dog leash somewhere else, and you get maybe an hour rec time to move around, and that's mainly just so you don't die. So when you listen to some of the stories of the prisoners who set themselves on fire, they're talking about guards who were physically abusing them, who could not get any medical attention. The brother who talked about leaving, trying to get out because he knew that there wasn't a center for the burning. Talked about how the guard said, that was nice what you did, but we'll see you when you get back, in a way like as a threat, right? Like this is what was said. So it doesn't seem like it was necessarily coordinated as in some kind of organizational thing, but it just seems like it caught on as a means of protest to get out. I mean, again, we know this is in Virginia. Just thinking about there's so many different prisons, man. I could go all day, but thinking about there's another prison in Virginia, Buckingham Correctional Facility. Shaka Shakur, who actually comes out of Indiana, got into an altercation with the guard, and here in Indiana, and they sent him to Virginia, even though he's an Indiana prisoner who had been tortured and spent time on lockup and here in Indiana. If you think about Westville, Indiana, there was a supermax there, the MCC, and we were talking about people burning themselves. Well, I know in the 90s there was a brother who cut off his finger and tried to mail it to the governor to bring attention, right? So this is just how these prisons operate. So in Red Onion, it's no different. It's funny because here in Indiana, there was a similar Human Rights Watch report done on the MCC in Westville, and then that was done as well with the Red Onion prison too.
Yeah, unbelievable in so many. Buckingham is actually not that far from where I grew up, and just the stories you hear from people are just harrowing on many levels. And it brings me to a segue here that I think is related, and I want to talk about your book, which I think is a very important book, and I think it speaks to a critical issue because obviously when you look at the prison system disproportionately Black, we can look at so many of the things that we could go on here. The theme of the anger of Black America has become sort of a broader cultural undercurrent in American life, I think, especially since Ferguson. And your new text, or new-ish text, I should say, just to let people know, again, Laundering Black Rage, the washing of Black death, people, property, and profits, is looking at this sort of intersection of, I think, the greater prominence, you might say, of Black rage and sort of the cultural sphere of capitalist America, but looking at some of the contradictions of that. So, I mean, just give maybe people a synopsis of what you're addressing in the text and how you're looking at some of this.
Yeah, I'd probably have to come back and talk about that. I could go all day as well, but I guess to put it shortly, I'm a co-author of that book. My co-author, me and Rasul Mawad, we were trying to understand in 2020. It's not really about 2020, but we noticed in 2020, following the George Floyd uprisings, there was almost immediately these calls to do things that did not resolve the problem. fundamentally. So the Black rage was being funneled into Black capitalism. The Black rage and the rage that others shared was being funneled into diversity statements, DEI, and it was also being used to fund repression, right? It was being used to give police more budgets. It was being used to give police more cameras, more equipment, et cetera. So the idea was this is a form of laundering, right? And not in a metaphorical sense, but an actual form of laundering where the Black rage becomes this capital that is then inserted into the state through capitalism's different means of production, and it comes out on the other end as some kind of commodity to quell that rage and to keep it within the containment of the state. I don't think that's limited to Black rage as well. I know y'all were talking about Syria. I think you can see a very similar situation where legitimate rage at the state of what people were dealing with in Syria got totally turned into now where you have it being ran by terrorists that America wants to say are not, right? And it's destabilizing the region and also destabilizing resistance across the region, right? So, but that came from a legitimate place, but there's a way that because the rage has to go through the actual means of production, it has to labor through it. It's not just a feeling, and we talk about it as a sense of labor, that it could be turned against you and used as ways to, again, either repress or we say bribe. And we say many of these institutions operate as fronts. On one side, they sell you that they're doing something good, and they might even be doing that. Like they might be providing food or like any front we think about, but in the back, they're selling drugs, right? So that's what the state typically does. So a prison will say it's there to rehabilitate you, and I don't think it does much of that. But at the same time, it's a form of national oppression. It's a form of counterinsurgency and so on and so forth. The United States might invade a country and say the military is here to liberate the people, or they might fund a group to quote unquote liberate the people, and that's just a front for other action. But they use the rage, the pain, the suffering of people as a means to launder, to create this other outcome that goes against the will of the people. And sometimes done with the consent of people to the point where they don't even realize it themselves. That's usually the scariest part.
It really is. And I think one thing that's important that is advertised as being talked about in this book, which I'm very excited to read, is the idea of upending that process you just described through the anti-colonial struggle, and you call it a reverse laundering conquest, which sounds really cool. So can you talk, I guess, summarize briefly, because we could talk about this for hours, what you mean by upending that laundering process?
Well, yeah, at some point it almost upends itself because it causes total destruction, right? I mean, we're watching this now with climate or other things that are going on. Reverse laundering, the definition is to take something that is legitimate to fund something that is illegitimate. And I don't want to speak too specifically because I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But you follow in terms of you take something. So, for example, if I'm well, not me, because again, I'm not doing any of these things. But if someone is engaged, if they just have a regular job, they make their money from their paycheck, and then they use that money to fund something that exists outside of the system. People can fill in their imagination for what that is. That could be done nefariously, like we see in the United States, where they took legitimate congressional funds to fund, the Contras, and to sell guns abroad and use that money to fund dirty wars, right? Like that was reverse laundering. But there's a way that since we live in a capitalist system and the resources have to come through our hands to do the laundering, that there's a way that those resources can be reversed to fund something that's not legitimized by the state, that's not legitimized by capital, that doesn't even necessarily need to be in the forefront or needs to be loud or screaming, but it's something we can fund, or not even fund as in just money, but whatever resources we have. I've talked to people in talks, I say, whatever your surplus is, if you have patience, you have a surplus of patience, you have a surplus of space, you have a surplus of money, you have a surplus of time, whatever that is, using that surplus that some of us have to fund things that are not legitimized by the state, to resource things that are not legitimized by the state, to upend that process for our own liberation. I hope that answers that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good start, but you never want to answer it fully because you want people to buy the book and go out and get it. So that, I think it gives people just enough of a taste to get out there. Laundering Black Rage, the washing of Black death, people, property, and profits, of which you were the co-author. And just as always on all these points, Too Black, always great to have you with us. Really appreciate you taking time and joining us here on the Freedom Side.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Rania?
Eugene, I mean, the state of America's prisons, just to go back to the initial topic we were talking about, is so grotesque. And, I just sometimes I think it's so interesting, like the way that we think the U.S. is just a civilized country when we literally operate this disgusting, horrific incarceration system full of people. Like they want you to think everybody's like a murderer. That's it. Like, so you don't care, like, oh, who cares? Like a bunch of murderers and rapists. Like, actually, that's not the case. A lot of people in America are in prison for like not actually murdering people, just for like being poor and sometimes committing petty crimes, a lot of nonviolent offenses. And it's like we imprison more people than any other country per capita in the world. It's an entire industry. In some cases, it's privatized, and we torture people. We have a system of torture across the United States, and people just rot away. And sorry, just that Red Onion State Prison. I mean, that's one of so many across the country. And it also, we didn't even get to like the racial element of it, because I remember from when I was covering Red Onion State Prison, it was like all the guards are white. And in this like rural area of Virginia, and most of the people in this prison are Black men who are like from cities around the state. So it's just one horror after another, and it's something that we don't really talk too much about because it's so normalized. But yeah, people are just rotting away in solitary confinement and being strapped down and being tortured and being neglected with medical care, and just in these like weird sort of black holes where these guards can do whatever they want to them without consequence.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, and certainly I can remember, even when they built Red Onion State Prison, which was part of a big, drive to build these prisons when George Allen was the governor in the '90s, and Virginia was. People talk about Project 2025. I think we need to start talking about Project 1994, and the crime bill and everything that came in the wake of that, which was federal, yes, but it kickstarted so much of what was happening on the state level, and the state like Virginia was really at the vanguard and continues to be. You drive down the highways, especially 64, going towards Hampton Roads. You always had the chain gang out there. I can remember it vividly as a young person, cutting the grass and doing all that. You're out there on the chain gang. They got the riding boss out there with the M16. It's like out of an old movie, but it's today. And I remember the Charlottesville courthouse used to have the leaves raked by trustees, from the complex, and you have the whole prison jumpsuit on and the whole nine. And of course, it was like Texas, Florida, and Virginia at that time. Thankfully, Virginia has ended the death penalty. That used to compete to basically see how many people they could execute every single year. And the impact of it was massive. And I think the point you make is so well taken. So more to say on that, of course, and we'll continue to cover that and continue to push it. I think, Rania, I remember your piece as well from Truth Out on Red Onion State Prison. Still very relevant today, I think, to understand the context of this. And shout out to the Virginia Defender, Phil and all those folks there who are doing a lot to try to track this story down and hold folks accountable. There's going to be some hearings in the state legislature soon about this. But we're going to turn now to the Republic of Korea, South Korea, where there's been quite a bit happening since the attempt to bring in martial law by President Yoon recently. We are very, very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Joo-hyun Park, who's a member of Notital and the engagement editor at The Real News. Joo-hyun, as always, thanks so much for being with us here on the show.
Eugene, Rania, wish I could be here under better circumstances, but it's good to be here with you.
Well, we're happy to have you here with us to understand it. There was the attempt at bringing in martial law, now the attempts to impeach President Yoon, who is resisting his impeachment. Maybe just to start, where do things stand now? He's still the president, but does it seem likely he could be impeached, or where are we in the political element of it?
Yes, so to just start things off, it's been a real roller coaster, Eugene. Things are changing day by day, hour by hour. A week ago, the ruling party was boycotting the impeachment vote. Now it's looking like that could shift very quickly. The vote is coming up this Saturday. The ruling party leader has turned on President Yoon and announced his support for the impeachment. And by the latest tally that I've seen, 7 out of the 8 votes that are needed from the ruling party to secure that vote have been expressed publicly. Now, I think something that needs to be understood about the process is that impeachment does not mean the end of this struggle, because the impeachment is only an indictment. After that, the Supreme Court needs to make a verdict, but crucially, that court does not have quorum at this time. There are 9 spots on the bench, only 6 of them are filled, and 7 are required under the Constitution in order to make a ruling of this kind. So what that means is that this could drag on for several more months, and there may be many opportunities for President Yoon and for the ruling party to affect the outcome. We do have to remember that while things are looking bad for him right now, he does still have loyalists in the government, and there are a lot of details coming about the extent of his coup plans, which really show what chilling, disgusting atrocities this man was planning for the Republic of Korea. That was narrowly avoided just last week, but that doesn't mean that we won't see a possible return to this these sort of threats that have been made against the people of Korea.
Julian, I'd love for you to elaborate on some of the details that are coming out of what this coup plan was, which included this attempt to trigger a limited war with North Korea. And also, I do recall when this coup or when this martial law was first being reported, Yoon was basically accusing his rivals of all being like North Korean sympathizers. I'm also curious if you could so tell us about some of those details about what this plan was and why it's so dangerous. And you could maybe walk us through a bit about some of the militaristic, hawkish policies that had already been implemented by this administration ahead of what seems like a very well planned out strategy to trigger a war with North Korea.
Absolutely. Before I get into it, I do need to start with the caveat that this is an evolving situation. There are ongoing hearings happening in the parliament, ongoing investigations. There are claims that are currently being made, evidence that is being presented. So there is an array of information that's out there. There are things that we know for certain at this point, and there are things where we still need to wait for a little bit more evidence to definitively say what is fact or not. Let's start with what we know. What are the facts? The facts are that the planning for this coup began in July of 2023, so it's been planned for more than a year. We also know that President Yoon personally gave orders to high-ranking members of the military and police to arrest key lawmakers on the night of the coup. We also know that because we have seen the planning documents for the coup itself, that they cited precedents for martial law that included the Gwangju and Jeju massacres, which are 2 of the worst atrocities in Korea's modern history. So already this is painting a pretty grim picture, and it's demonstrating that although what actually transpired last week did not seem to be a very well-planned coup, there was actually a great deal of planning that went into this, and there were very dark aspirations that were also informing the way that this coup was being executed. Now let's get into what certain lawmakers are saying, and these are claims that we still need to wait for a little bit more evidence to be absolutely certain of. But a number of opposition lawmakers are currently coming forward with claims from anonymous military sources that President Yoon may have been planning to essentially restart the Korean War. The claim is that specifically that he was looking for a limited conflict with North Korea that could provide a pretext for the martial law order. Now, I've come on this program in the past to talk about the garbage balloons that the DPRK has been sending to South Korea this year. This is a crucial detail. The Yoon administration has already used this as a pretext to make a number of escalations along the inter-Korean border this summer. But back in October, there was a new line that was crossed because Pyongyang reported for the first time that they had spotted several drones violating their airspace that month, and that a couple of these had actually crashed. And they were able to produce photographs showing that these drones bore a very strong resemblance to models used by South Korea's military. Now, at the time, the defense ministry in South Korea said that it could not confirm, and that's not answering in the affirmative or the negative. They were not denying it. They simply said they could not confirm whether or not these drones came from military sources. Now, what we are learning this week, thanks to the testimony of lawmaker Pak Pomge, who is of the Democratic Party, he is saying that a military source has told him that these drones were in fact sent by the South Korean military. And what's more, there was also a container fire this week at a South Korean military base where several of these drones were stored. The commander of the South Korean drone force was then brought to parliament for questioning this week, and lawmakers asked him point blank, who ordered you to send drones to Pyongyang? Where did you launch the drones from? And all he could say, again, was, I can't confirm that. So we have military officials that are receiving very intense, very pointed questioning. And instead of responding in the affirmative or the negative, they're not even seeking to deny it. They're simply saying that they are unable to confirm information. So this is raising a lot of suspicions within South Korea as to the veracity of the claims that have been put forward by lawmakers about plans for a limited war. There is also a separate claim that has been put forward by another lawmaker who is saying that a military source has also told him that the former defense minister, Kim Yong-hyun, who is currently in jail awaiting an indictment, it is reported that Minister Kim attempted to order a direct strike on North Korea last month in response to one of these volleys of garbage balloons. Now, when questioned, the Joint Chiefs of Staff did say, they actually did this time deny that that order was given. However, when they were pressed around the matter of whether these conversations were happening around having a direct strike, all they could say was sometimes the military discusses certain scenarios or something to that effect. So we have a lot of very interesting claims that have been put forward so far. There is a picture that is coming together that holds ground, at least from the standpoint of thinking about motive. What we are waiting to understand is whether or not there will be an opportunity to have decisive evidence, decisive testimony that helps us clear up what has happened. But in any case, I think that something that we need to take away from this experience is just how dangerous the situation in Korea could have been and could still become. And we also need to be asking some really difficult questions about the role of Washington in all of this. Now, we don't know a lot about what Washington's involvement could have been, but I think even without knowing much of the specifics, what we can definitively say is that this was a president who, from the beginning, demonstrated extreme anti-democratic and militaristic tendencies. He was embraced by Washington. He was exalted as not only a key ally, but a democratic leader in the region and the world. They were calling South Korea a global pivotal state. Members of the Biden administration were recommending that President Yoon receive the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I think this tells us a lot about the kinds of alliances the United States is willing to make, and also the effect that it's having on South Korean politics, because it is really the most reactionary, the most dangerous elements of South Korean society that are the closest to the US, because they are the only ones who are willing to uphold an agenda that is basically willing to transform Korea into a war zone yet again in order to serve US interests. So we need to be scrutinizing this very, very closely. I think it's important that people keep their eye on the ball, and we continue to watch the situation and resist any attempts to present a narrative that everything is tidy and done and democracy has won the day, because that is clearly not the case and not what really is going on here.
Well, one of the other aspects of this is it seems to have struck a deep chord amongst many of the people in the ROK in South Korea. We've seen huge demonstrations. We've seen, the initial opposition to the martial law with a number of, heroic acts by people confronting the military and different pieces like that. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that as well, Ju-hyun, about how this has seemingly at least really brought the popular forces, into the forefront of the discussion about what the future of the country should be.
Absolutely. I think over the last week, we've seen tremendous bravery from the masses of people in South Korea. When the initial announcement of martial law was made, I think the terror that must have been felt by millions of people would have been so deep and palpable, especially given that martial law is something that is in recent memory for South Koreans in particular. The last time the country was under martial law was between 1980 to 1987. My mom was a student in that time. She walked through seas of tear gas practically every day just to get to her classes. She wasn't even an activist. These are things that are really embedded in people's memories. And I think that it's really a testament to the bravery of our people that so many folks just mobilized in the middle of the night. This announcement was made close to midnight. And in spite of that, tens of thousands of people were gathering at the National Assembly to ensure that martial law could not return to the country. People were walking on foot across bridges in Seoul just to get to the protest location. I think that it really speaks to people's willingness to fight back. When the initial impeachment vote happened, there were over 1 million people in the streets of Seoul. And since then, these demonstrations have continued. And I think, there's a lot of emphasis in the media right now on the strength of South Korea's institutions or of its Liberal Democratic Party. But I think the real protagonists here are the people of South Korea. I think they're the ones that are really driving the situation, really affecting the landscape and the kinds of decisions that key power players can make, including President Yoon. And I think it's thanks to their pressure that we are seeing so many lawmakers begin to fall in line from the ruling party. And I think it also explains a lot of the bravery being demonstrated by a number of the opposition lawmakers as well, asking these difficult questions, being willing to do things like spend the night in the parliament to ensure that it can't be taken again. So I think this is a moment where, there is a lot of pride to be felt, and at the same time, just an incredible sense of, I don't really want to call it despair, but there is also a pain. Why is it that another generation has to struggle in this way just to ensure some of the most basic rights that should be taken for granted by, all people in the world? But, particularly in a country like South Korea, where so many generations of people have had to engage in the same struggle. The last time that millions of people had to be out in the streets to depose a South Korean president was less than 10 years ago, right? And now many of the same people who were out in that struggle back in 2016, 2017 are back at it again. And so I think while there's much to celebrate, it also speaks to the deep structural nature of the crisis that is facing South Korea, that is reflected in the difficulties of the impeachment process. It's reflected in the influence that the United States has had on the Yoon administration. And I think it really speaks to how much further there is still left to go in terms of building a real political project that serves the majority of people and also achieves a sovereign country, which is really what this is about at the end of the day. Is there going to be a sovereignty for the United States, for the big conglomerates in South Korea, only for the ruling class? Or is there going to be a sovereignty that's based on the will of the actual masses of people and the broad majority of society?
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Juhyun, it's great to have you here to sort through all this. It's, as you say, an ongoing dynamic situation, so we'll continue to cover it as best we can. But thank you so much, as always, for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Of course. Thank you again, and I hope you both have a blessed day.
Rania?
Wow, what a wild story. I mean, it just continues to get crazier. I mean, I thought the end of it was after the attempted martial law stuff, and then now it's just like, holy, I'm not gonna curse.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Family show, pro-animal show, pro-family show. We're coming to the holidays, right? So the sort of Christmas card reality of where we are here. But no, I think you're right. I mean, I have to say, this is maybe no story has shocked me more in the past 6 months, I have to say, and a lot has happened. There were some shocking things, but this really, I mean, there's some things that, in many ways are maybe bigger stories in terms of the news, but I was very surprised to see this. I think it's very interesting to watch. I think for those of us in the United States, we have to watch this extremely closely because most people don't know, but the military of South Korea is actually under the control of the United States. It's under, like, the U.S. controls the South Korean military. And some of the elements that were deployed, like the special forces of South Korea, are so integrated with the United States. I'm not saying the U.S. necessarily sponsored it or whatever. I'm not going to put that out there yet, at least until we hear more. But it's hard for me to believe that they were not aware ahead of time that this was going to happen, and obviously then took no action to stop it. And I think that it just raises all sorts of questions, a historical thing. Obviously, Biden is the president, the Democrat. Jimmy Carter was the president when the Mr. Park came in with martial law. And I'll close on this, Rania, and move to our next topic. But, when he came in, Park, they wanted to have an election the next year, a fake election, because they wanted to show, oh, this is not a dictatorship, even though it was obviously, a military dictatorship. So he told the people around him, he said, I have to win, but I can't win by 100%. So maybe I should win by, I think it was like 98% or 99%. So he instructed them to have like 1% to 2% or something like that. We have someone can fact check me in the comments, voting against him, so that it showed that it was like a true democracy, so that America could also turn around and say we support democracy in South Korea. But it was mentioned by Ju Hyun, the Gwangju massacre. I think people should look that up. If you've never heard of it before, really a very important moment in Korean history and the struggle for democracy there, which is what people are defending today. So anyway, we'll continue to cover it. We'll continue to follow it, but we'll go to what maybe was maybe the most astonishing story. Not necessarily the one that surprised me the most, but certainly the most astonishing, I think, maybe not even of the past 6 months, but of even a little bit longer than that. That's the collapse of the government in Syria and the moment that we're in now. And obviously it's an ongoing conversation, Rania. We can't cover it all here. So I'll just preface my comments by saying I really hope people after this show also get an opportunity, in addition to listening to you here, to look at the interview you did with Elijah earlier this week for Dispatches, which I thought was, as always, packed full of information and critical insights on this issue, and went really deeply on a number of different fronts. But yeah, I'll just say a few things, maybe then turn it over to you. The culmination, first and foremost, of just an unbelievable campaign of an attempt to destroy a country, since 2011. I don't know what the final tally was. I think Qatar spent like $2 billion, $3 billion trying to overthrow the government in Syria. You had pretty much all the other Gulf states jumping in. You had the US, you had Israel, you had the Caesar sanctions and other sanctions, which were, some of the worst, if not the strictest sanctions on the planet Earth, trying to do everything possible to just strangle the average person on the street. In Syria, the constant bombings and attacks by Israel, the partitioning of the country that was facilitated by the United States and Turkey. It's, maybe it's something that the full magnitude of it, even just listening to myself right now, is still kind of sinking in. I'm sure maybe there is a historical parallel, but the lengths that were gone to destroy a nation and to lead to the downfall of a government, I don't know what the parallel is. There's nothing that really comes to mind directly, and the suffering of the average person. And, we hear so much, of course, about the suffering that was brought through in different ways. Some of it, of course, coming from the government in different, guises. And there's many things out there, so I don't need to talk about that. People have seen it. But the suffering that was deliberately inflicted, I think it was like 125,000 Syrians died fighting some of this opposition in the time prior to the freezing of the conflict. So, huge numbers of families and others disrupted, changed for forever in this context, and all because a handful of powerful entities decided that they did not want Assad. They wanted somebody else. And no matter who had to pay the price, they were going to do anything possible to bring him down and to create such a terrible state of affairs and chaos that ultimately he would come down. Now he has come down. We're seeing, terrible scenes, and I know you're seeing and hearing more. You're there in Lebanon, but it's just amazing for me to reflect on this project to really take down Syria. And it's really unfortunate, I think, that context has just been totally omitted from all of the commentary in the Western media. It's like there were never any sanctions, like there was never a dirty war, like there was never, I was going back and reading, Rania, and I'll stop here and hand it to you, some of the stuff from 2013 in the Western media about like the elections that were happening. And, very begrudgingly, you have Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times reporting on all these people going to vote in favor of Assad and saying, yeah, there's all these people who are so angry at the opposition and think that it would be terrible for their country if they came in, and they have criticisms of Assad, but they want to, also protect their country in ways they think are relevant. And it's like, this is their own reporting. And it's like, it never happened. It was just totally memory hold. It's been totally memory hold. All these things have been totally left out. It's just this context-free, people are free, people are happy, all these different pieces. And I know there's elements to that, but it just feels like historical malpractice that, there's not a deeper, more contextual discussion of how we got to this point. But anyway, that's enough of me going on and on. You're right there in the pressure cooker of the region. So, I mean, obviously, I'm sure you have many thoughts, but anything you want to offer here?
Well, yeah, I'll also preface what I want to say with I really encourage people to go watch the episode I did with Elijah Magnier like 2 days ago. It's, an excellent overview of the parts of the Syrian war that have been largely written out of the present day history that the mainstream media is giving us. And look, it's not a black and white situation when it comes to Syria. This is a country that, like a lot of countries actually across the region, unfortunately, had a very repressive dictatorship. No one ever denied that. My whole life, I've known that. My family's known that. I mean, Syria at one point occupied portions of Lebanon, and that impacted my family pretty dramatically, like it did a lot of people's families in Lebanon, who were on secret police lists. And, lots of people across the region have been in Syrian prisons. And, Baathism has had a very unfortunate way of ruling in the countries where it's taken hold as a one-party, state, whether it's Iraq or Syria. And I don't want to take that away from people, because I do know that in the downfall of this particular government, there are people who were even supportive of this government during the war, for reasons I can explain, who are kind of breathing a sigh of relief. It was a really repressive atmosphere for decades and decades that this government in Syria created. That said, I say that because the people who supported this government during the war after 2011 supported it not because they love Baathism or love Assad. They didn't fight and die against the opposition groups because they love the Syrian regime, as it's called. They did it because this is what's being written out. The US and the Gulf states in the region, and Israel, by the way, launched a proxy war on Syria where they funded a collection of sectarian religious extremist groups that were made up of ISIS, al-Qaeda, and various different named groups that were all connected to them and had a similar ideology that wreaked havoc across the country and tried to collapse the Syrian state. And lots of people in Syria, secular people, even conservative religious people, and especially minorities, saw the behavior of these groups after the Arab Spring and felt the alternative to the Syrian government that was being presented to them was so disgusting, reprehensible, and violent. They supported and fought for the government side. And it was such a threat to the entire region, not just to Syria. You had ISIS take over huge swaths of Iraq. Parts of Lebanon were invaded. There was car bombs going off in Lebanon that were directed by Mohammed al-Jolani's group, who is now, in charge of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It was destabilizing Lebanon, and you had attacks in other parts of the world by this group that was based in Syria. So this was a massive security threat, which is why you had the Iranians, the Iraqis, and the Lebanese, and then eventually the Russians get involved to save the Syrian state from falling into the hands of ISIS and al-Qaeda. That's what's being written out. And it's really important context, because now it's being described as though, like, the Iranians and Hezbollah and all these evil people just came in to prop up this man called Assad, as opposed to, no, there was like a collaboration that was carried out, a partnership to defeat ISIS. Much like what you saw in World War II, where you saw a lot of different contradictory elements come together to defeat the Nazis, including the US allying with Russia or the Soviet Union, where Stalin was in charge. You know what I mean? So these are not people who typically ally, right? They did to defeat the Nazis. So you had a similar thing take place here. And the reason that context is important is that the group that led the attack on the Syrian government, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is a rebranded version of Mohammed al-Jolani's al-Nusra, which was the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria during the Syrian war. And I really recommend going and listening to my conversation with Elijah about that. And look, this group seems to have evolved. It seems to have pragmatically, not ideologically, pragmatically moderated a bit. And they did take over Syria. The government also didn't fight back. Assad screwed over his people. He did, and that's what people here are saying, like in Lebanon. And my friends in Syria as well, they feel abandoned by Assad after fighting and giving their lives to protect the state from collapsing. He left without saying a word, and also while lying to people throughout, saying, oh, no, we're just retreating to regroup to fight from here. So there's a lot of anger, including in the resistance axis. You see a lot of finger pointing. Iran is saying we offered help, they didn't want it. Russia saying we offered help and warned them, they didn't want it. We also told them to negotiate with Turkey. He wouldn't do it. And you also have like sort of leaks coming out of Hezbollah saying, and also the Yemenis, by the way, saying they had basically begged Assad to open the Golan front during the genocide in Gaza. He refused to. That's a whole other conversation, but there's so many elements to this. And I think it's all important context, but the fact of the matter is that at the same time, it also doesn't really matter anymore, because Syria is different. The Assad government, the Assad regime is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And now you have a situation where people are celebrating. They're happy. The images, of people being freed from prisons are very heartwarming and also like very disturbing, because obviously people suffered tremendously in that prison system. I hope it doesn't get replicated. And a lot of people are hoping the same thing. But you also have a situation where you have armed groups of men in a really chaotic environment in the aftermath of basically the collapsing of a state, kind of roaming and patrolling the streets. Many of them are religious extremists. Some of them are foreign fighters. There's been a few incidences here and there of violence, some sectarian violence, some kind of random violence, people kind of taking advantage of a collapse in law and order. And so people are holding their breath, kind of scared, and just waiting to see what happens, especially people from minority sects and secular people. And that should not be dismissed, by the way. People are trying to dismiss that. Those fears should not be dismissed, because that can turn into a very dangerous, frightening situation. That said, there's also another element of this, which is the Israelis. The Israelis took complete advantage, and right after this happened, they began bombing Syria. They've carried out almost, if not more at this point, 500 airstrikes on Syria since this regime change happened. 500 airstrikes. And what have they been doing with those airstrikes is completely dismantling and destroying Syria's entire military infrastructure. All of its air bases, all of its naval bases, all of its weapons, all of its air defense capabilities are basically gone. So now you have a new Syria, and, the media is portraying it as Israel is striking Assad's weapons and Assad's bases. These are military infrastructure that belong to the country of Syria, no matter who's in charge of it, whether it's Bashar al-Assad, whether it's Mohammed al-Jalani, whether it's whatever transitional, government is being put in place right now. That is the Syrian government, and this is their sovereign military infrastructure that is being calculatedly dismantled by the Israelis with a U.S. nod, and the world is saying nothing. And people are disturbed that the new authorities in Syria haven't said anything. Now, do they have the capacity to fight back? Not really. It's just been taken away from them by the Israelis. However, it is disturbing. They have not even addressed it. They've dismissed it. And so people are very concerned about what this means for resistance in the region, because there are fears that whoever takes over in Syria is going to allow Israel to basically do what they're doing right now, which is to expand territory. Israel has basically thrown out the 1974 agreement that had a buffer zone in the Golan Heights between the illegally Israeli occupied side of the Golan Heights and the part that is still held by Syria. And that was in place until now. Now Israel's saying, we don't respect this agreement anymore. And they went over the buffer zone and are claiming to create a new buffer zone. But what they're actually doing is taking Syrian territory, which their settler groups are already planning to settle. Like, this is real. This is like Greater Israel Project happening in front of our faces. There are reports of them forcibly evicting people from their homes in certain areas and they're actually apparently like 20 kilometers away from Damascus. They're claiming they won't go to Damascus, but it's the Israelis, who knows. But also they're surrounding Lebanon from the Syrian side to cut off Lebanon further. I mean, this is an incredibly dangerous situation. They've also still not fully withdrawn from Lebanon. Every single day since the ceasefire in Lebanon a couple weeks ago, the Israelis have bombed and killed people and shot people, and their forces are still in southern Lebanon. They're supposed to withdraw over the 60-day period of this ceasefire, but who knows? It's the Israelis. Maybe they won't withdraw. And also, again, their settlers are talking about settling southern Lebanon. They are planning and like deciding which plots of land. There's even been Israeli settlers who have come into Lebanon to assess the territory, with the Israeli army just kind of looking on and doing nothing about it, just like they do in the West Bank. And they've been doing that in Syria as well. This is really, really dangerous. And there doesn't seem to be anybody to stop them anymore. It's Hezbollah sort of on its own in Lebanon. It's much more weakened. It's extremely weakened compared to what it was like 2 months ago because of all the Israeli bombings. And now, I mean, Hezbollah is still able to protect southern Lebanon on the ground, but the deterrence is gone. They don't have Syria anymore because they've been pushed out of Syria by what just transpired over the last 5 days or 2 weeks. And now Syria is basically not a part of the resistance axis anymore. It's believed they probably can't be. They don't even have the capacity to be. Their defenses have been taken out. It's a really horrifying situation. It's great for Israel. It's great for America. It's bad for everybody else in the region because at the end of the day, I want to see freedom and democracy flourish across the entire Middle East, not just Syria. I'd love to see it in Egypt. I'd love to see it in Jordan. Also incredibly repressive police states that have prisons, not so different, where people are held and tortured just like in Syria. I want to see all those people freed too. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the Israelis really, really expanding their Greater Israel project like they never have before. The opportunity is ripe. The opportunity is there. They're taking it, and the forces of resistance are extremely weakened at this point. In Syria, it doesn't seem like anybody's going to be able to push back against it, and that's what's incredibly scary. And, before I go back to you here, Eugene, I just want to add to that in this moment, this issue has been so divisive. It's been divisive throughout the Syrian war. It split the Palestine Solidarity Movement back in 2016 and 2017 in a really significant way that it finally started to recover from, especially after the last year of genocide. And now nobody's talking about Gaza. Lebanon has been forgotten despite all the devastation in Lebanon. And we're back where we were, where people are fighting with each other. People are calling each other Assadists, which is a term that's meaningless to begin with, but it's even more meaningless than it was before now because there is no more Assad. There's no reason to run around calling people Assadists anymore. There is no more Assad. This is a moment in time where a genocidal settler state, Israel, is still the biggest existential crisis to everybody in this region. And the facts are the facts. Syria is in the hands of somebody else now. We have to deal with that and hope for the best. I really do hope for the best in that situation. But the majority of people who are watching this are Americans, and they're likely in the US. And so we have to, in this moment, try not to fall for smears, slander, and get into the whole idea of making Syria this divisive issue that tears the Palestine movement apart. Because so much work has been done over the last year to push back against Zionism. And despite the fact that Israel has materially gained a lot in the short term, at least in this region, it is more isolated than ever internationally. And there is a global movement to push back against Zionism, Israeli settler colonialism, US imperialism. And we need to focus on that more than anything else. It's so crucial. Because what I'm seeing right now with the divisiveness is incredibly disturbing. And there is an attempt to really silence anybody who wants to question the media representation of Syria right now, or how things are going to move forward in Syria. And I don't think that's a good atmosphere to have, especially when there is still a genocide ongoing in Gaza.
No, I think that's a great point, and I'll just basically leave it there with agreeing with you. I mean, I think we have to hope for the best. We have to look at this. I'll just say this, there's a lot to be said about human rights in Syria, but I think people should also read what Amnesty International, if you want to quote them on Assad, was saying about HTS in Idlib. And you might be surprised to hear some of that. And I make that point really looking at the impact of sanctions right there. And you, Rania, I make that point really, not to be excessively provocative, but I think so many people have said, well, you can't put everybody in the camp of HTS in the opposition. You can't say that just because they had forced disappearances and executions and all that and torture, that everyone is like that. And of course, all the people in the opposition are not like that. But the same is also true on the other side. And I think you made the point very well, Rania, about why some people did side with the Syrian government under Assad against some of these opposition groups. And I think if there's going to be a positive future moving forward, the kind of divisiveness that takes out all the context of why people are acting in certain ways on both sides of the conflict is not going to get us there. And, I want to be as hopeful as we can. Obviously, we've seen some collaboration between, elements of the former Syrian government and the new forces that are there. There's a lot of talk about not having a de-Baathification like Iraq and having things collapse into civil war. You even see Russia and Iran continue to try to be engaged in different ways, along with the Gulf states, along with other entities. So, I think hopefully there is a path forward for national reconciliation in a way that can be really positive for Syria and for the region. But I do think that these nuances that you've introduced here are critically important to understand. And yes, Palestine, we have to keep our eyes on Gaza. And I'll just say one more time, I hope folks have an opportunity to check out what you did with Elijah Magnier. I guess that was Monday. God, this week is going so fast. But you can find it in the live tab of our YouTube page if you are going to Breakthrough News /YouTube, youtube.com/Breakthrough News. I wish it was breakthroughnews.com/YouTube. But that being said, let's just leave it there for now. This is obviously an ongoing conversation and a lot to be said and to be had here. So I think that pretty much brings us to the close of the show here today. Rania, anything you want to leave our viewers with before we get out of here?
Yes, I want to remind people that they can help support our journalism here at Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and becoming a member for as little as $5 a month. Though there's no cap, you can give us more than that. And you can be a supporter of independent media in a moment where we are just flooded with a tsunami of propaganda, promoting genocide, promoting war, promoting just, destroying the world. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Also, make sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm.
It does indeed. Obviously, we're coming to the end of the year here. So on the freedom side, not Breakthrough News, a little bit of an end of the year hiatus. We will be back with you the day after New Year's Day. So get ready for that. We're going to have a great show loaded up for you here, and we'll have great content from Breakthrough News going forward to the next few weeks. So you don't need to worry about that. We'll have you covered on a number of different fronts. But big shout out to all of our patrons. Big shout out to all of our viewers. Big shout out to the entire Freedom Side team at Breakthrough News that makes this show happen week in and week out. And for myself, for Rania, we will see you next time.
Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.